talking, you're right at the end of World War II, right? 1947, you're still in Okinawa?
1946,
46.
yeah, left. uh, where were we at? We was in the 37th Battalion. There wasn't we? End of the war,
You're in the 37th still?
and the battalion broke up. People started going home. I was transferred to Seabee maintenance unit, and I become a shovel operator in the coral pit. 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. I shovel coral, dump trucks, doing that on the highways and byways and quail walls and what have you. It was an interesting job. I started working for a lieutenant. He lasted 1 week and he went home. And I think the next week I was promoted to my Seabee machinist mate at 3rd class. And I sewed on my machinist mate 3rd class crow, my undress uniform, and I thanked everybody for the pay raise. But I worked for a chief then. He took over the project of the coral pits and in charge of the blasters and so on and so forth. And he lasted a couple of weeks. And 1st class come around and told me he was in charge. And he was around for 2-3 weeks. And one day, the executive officer of the maintenance unit come out and said, "Well, you're in charge." And I become in charge of the coral pit. And one of my duties was to make sure that that we had good security around the pit because there was still Japanese out around. We had a couple of armed guards guarding us all the time, and we had Korean prisoners of war working for us in the pit, breaking up the large chunks of coral so to fit in our shovel buckets and doing odd jobs. We also had them taking care of our camp. They worked in the galley. They took care of the maintenance of the camp. They were prisoners of war captured with the Japanese. The Japanese had conscripted these Koreans and made laborers out of them, engineers. The group we had was fine, enjoyable outfit to be around, and I come close friends with called the honcho, because they had one supervisor and he was the honcho, and as it turns out he was the mayor of the small village up in which is now North Korea. It was close to Christmas time. I remember that I found a peacoat for him to wear because it was pretty chilly out there, and he was so proud of that peacoat that he invited me up to marry his daughter, and it was a pretty hilarious bunch. And he told about being drafted and the punishments that the Japanese give the Koreans and guiding them in the digging of the caves and so on and so forth, and how and the Marines come by, and they all surrendered to the Marine Corps.
Get away from the Japanese.
Yeah, they could get away from the Japanese. So eventually they got put on a ship, and along with 2 Korean comfort women that Japanese had brought down from Korea when they or Manchuria, and a lot of the troops, Japanese troops came from Korea and Manchuria to Okinawa, and they brought their comfort women with them.
And that's making news now.
Yeah. The ladies were well supplied with goods. They had a spot on the afterdeck of the ship, and all kinds of crates they went home with. So they picked up belongings along the way. But I kept the address of this honcho. I assume he went back to become a mayor of his village, and I thought, well, sometime I'll just visit him, and whether I married his daughter or not, I would like to run across him again. And but I decided to go to work for the Chinese. They come over, a colonel come over and recruited me to go up on the Yangtze River to run a shovel, and they built a dam. And I said, fine. I signed a contract, $1,000 a month, and I had to live in, and a maid to go with it. And lo and behold, we had a plane trip back to the States too at the end of the year, and anyway, it was a pretty good deal for somebody, and I was kind of looking forward to it. In the meantime, I kept pushing coral into trucks and doing my thing, and we still had our security around the perimeter of the coral pits, and suddenly the CBMU decided, the powers to be decided to demobilize them. The CBMU we was in consisted of a group of men that were assigned the job maintaining bases throughout the Pacific, and they would follow the war from one island to the other. They had started out in early 1942, and none of them. I feel sorry for none of them have been back to the States, and this is 1946. So they demobilized, and they were sent back. Us younger people who were frozen in the service due to a mandate by President Harry Truman, we all got an extra year in the service from our hitches. I had also had my machinist mate Seabee taken away from me, and he said, you can be anything you want to be in the Navy, but we're not having Seabees. They don't exist anymore, as far as the Navy is concerned. Unfortunately, they offered me a painter's rate or Anyway, several different oddball rates, and I asked us which one is not frozen in the service, and he says, well, the only one we got left is metalsmiths. So I become a metalsmith.
Yeah.
And the outfit broke up anyway, and I got transferred to the 58th Naval Construction Battalion, which had been overseas for a long time, and all kinds of people left, and they out of at one time we had at the peak of the war there, we had 100,000 Seabees stationed on Okinawa.
Wow.
They were just there for the invasion of Japan. Fortunately, nobody had to go. I might add on VJ Day as such, in September, that they signed a peace treaty ending the war on Missouri. I stood in awe and watched aircraft fly to Japan. Thousands of planes all day long. You couldn't believe. They flew off of carriers, they flew off the airstrips, and it was one sight to behold. The 58th Battalion, I checked in with them, and as a third-class metalsmith, and they said, well, what do you do? I said, well, I used to be a pipeliner, and I operate equipment. And they says, well, you know what a pipe is? And I said, yeah, I know what pipe is. And he said, well, but I'm an equipment operator. He said, no, you're a metalsmith. And our pipe is all metal, so you go to work on the pipeline. And we worked on the laying a pipeline across the island of Okinawa to White Beach Pier, so ships could come in and get fresh water. This pipeline was set on concrete pillars in the middle of rice paddies, and sometimes we worked in water up to our waist getting this pipe into position. When the pipeline was laid, I was pulled off and sent to an asphalt plant. And my duties in an asphalt plant, because I was a metalsmith, was to use a jackhammer and cut the lids of 55-gallon drums off of tar barrels and push these barrels into heating space, which was 140 degrees. I requested the prisoners of war to help me, and they said the Geneva Convention will not let prisoners of war into such terrible conditions. I said, you let me in. So I worked. Thank heavens it was a midnight shift, and I cut tar barrels and sent them on their way, and they through this heated way, and these tar barrels were somewhere around 500 pounds of tar in each drum, and you had to handle 500 pounds by yourself. We were short-handed. I had to go restock 2 o'clock in the morning. I got to drive a big dump truck, rock truck, to where we had the tar barrels stacked, and used a small crane to load the truck and brought them back to the asphalt plant and keep me busy and stock for the day shift. That was interesting because I had to sling all the tar barrels, stage them so you could lift them 4 at a time, and just the slings. The working conditions throughout that time was terrible, and the food was worse because as we were assigned to basically the graveyard ship, we had to have a supper because the time we got in at 8 o'clock in the morning, we had missed breakfast, and you had to stay awake until lunch. And if you got lunch, you was lucky, and you slept through dinner, and we usually fed somewhere around 9 o'clock at night. But unfortunately, we had a menu that considered a meatloaf. We had meatloaf something like 48 days in a row, and we refused any more meatloaf. I hated meatloaf anyway.
Is that why you don't eat meatloaf?
That is one reason I don't eat meatloaf. So refused to get on the trucks, and the commanding officer come down and he heard our story, and he said, break out steaks for these fellows. And we had a steak, first piece of meat that we'd had in 45 days or so. He said, now you get back on the trucks and we go to work. I said, yes, sir. And he sent an ensign down, 245s on his waist, and he says, and this man here is going to make sure that nobody does any harm to my asphalt plant. And so we had an ensign with us every night, 45s looking down from the watchtower. We were finishing up on WWII runways and working on the WWII runway, and so it's quite critical. Asphalt plant kept in operation. They even had ice cream showed up at our camp. That the officers got the ice cream, and Red Cross eventually got the ice cream makers, so they sold ice cream to us if you wanted ice cream. The WWII runway was eventually finished. It was made along the seashore, and half the village, or 3/4 of the village of WWII was bulldozed, and a runway run.
Really?
A naval operation base was made out of it. 58th Battalion decided powers to be said these rotate them home, and they requested volunteers to China, so I signed up for China. Go to Tsingtao. I didn't make that draft, so I signed up for Guam. And I was doing anything to get off Okinawa. And I didn't make Guam draft. I was assigned to WWII, Naval Operating Base. Took a draft of 14 people down. You must, about the Seabees at that time, probably 90% of us were anywhere from 17 to maybe 22 years old. It was all young kids, and we had learned enough to do many things. We were fortunate that the older people, when we went into battalions, trained us on different types of equipment and recorded them on what was known as driver's licenses. Such, you did not get on a piece of equipment you had not been checked out on. So I accumulated a long list of cranes and bulldozers and what have you, and trucks. And so I went to WWII, and I was a senior person, a third class metalsmith, and so I took this draft of, I think, about 15 men into WWII, and we checked in, and lo and behold, the captain says, "Well, thanks for bringing these people here." He says, "I sure need them." He says, "But," he says, "what do you do?" And I says, "I'm equipment operator." And he says, "Son, look out that window." He says, "I have aviators. I have pilots. All they have to do is they are my equipment operators. Ask for something for them to do. See that bunch walking up that street right there?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "They're picking up cigarette butts. That's something for them to do. We don't fly anymore." He said, "They fight for 4 hours a month to keep qualified in planes. And their 4 hours come from the one plane we authorized is to spray mosquitoes." And I said, "Well," he says, "you're going to be my head plumber. You're a metalsmith." And I don't know what the connections being a plumber and a metalsmith was, but I become head plumber. And of the 14, we were the beginning of, I would say, of the public works for Naval Operating Base. The Navy air type people had been there for probably a month, I guess, before we come in. The enlisted people and officers had established clubs. We started to go into the enlisted club and was refused by the leader of our air detachment on the base there. And he said, "You're Seabees, we want nothing to do with you. A scroungy looking bunch anyway, you know." So we went and stole a Quonset hut and a bunch of parachutes and dyed them all pink and made our own bar. And then they all started to want to come down and use ours, and we says no, denied. We were able to keep everything going. My job was to keep the sewer going because it ran directly into the bay, and the Airedales all had a lot of beer, and they threw down the toilets. It was nothing flush. And these cans always end up in a manhole and plugging up, and we had to plunge out the manhole every night because as they went back to the barracks, they threw the empty beer cans down the manhole. Also, I was in charge of all the diesel stoves for the barracks, and boilers and stuff like that. And it was quite a job. And we got, of the 14 men or so I brought down, 15 maybe it was, that's what we did, just maintain the base.
Did you drink back then?
The big what?
Did you drink?
Did I drink? Maybe beer, maybe one beer a day, something like that. I never was much of a drinker.
No, you never.
But I had enough points to go home. You know, been there long enough to go home. And I got called up to the captain's office, and the captain says, I will release you if you put plumbing in his Quonset hut. And because my family's coming out. I said, Captain, I'll do it. And I didn't know anything about plumbing, but putting in interior pipe and so on and so forth inside of a Quonset hut. But I got it done. I had the concrete floors poured in there, and one solution that befuddled me, how to set a stool. So I got in my little Jeep and I went around, started asking people how to set a stool. And I come across this Army outfit who finally said, we had an old sergeant there. He says, well, he says, get a bucket of putty. He says, you got putty? And I said, no, I don't have any putty. So he gave me a 5-gallon can of putty, and he said, you put it down, and pat it around and plop that stool down on it and bolt it down. And that's what he did. I didn't have the, and that's what, when I went up to the captain, I says, you come and inspect your quarters, and I says, and I'll leave this outfit. So, yes, he was very appreciative of the effort I put into it, and he was thrown. And he says, okay, I'll cut orders for you to go into the receiving station. And he says, by the way, there's a Chinese colonel here looking for you on base. Something about going to work in China. And I said, well, where did you see him last time? I went to talk to him. And he said, well, he's down at the officer's hut, and he's probably having a cocktail with pilots. I snuck down to the officer's hut and had the orderly down there get the colonel, and he come out and, oh, he says, yeah, he says, I have bad news for you. He says, you can't go to China. We're not going to build the dam. I said, what happened? He says the communists shot all the engineers and the surveyors.
So do you remember where we were? We were talking about Chinese colonel coming in and telling you communists had shot all the engineers.
Mm-hmm.
So did you get to go home?
Yeah, eventually I got to go home. Captain released me. He says, you know, he said, if you stay with me 2 years, I'll make you a chief petty officer. I says, Captain, I don't want to stay here 2 years and punch beer cans for a bunch of Airedales. So we signed the papers, and I went to receiving station. And, excuse me, ported in receiving station is run by Marines. They took my rifle away from me, which I've become quite close to over the years. And 2 rifles that I had procured from the Japanese I was going to bring back to the States. One of them was a sniper rifle, and I thought, it'd be great for hunting. But they confiscated that too, those 2. And went aboard a ship. It was a ship that had run aground and was damaged, and it was going back to the States to be decommissioned. It had come out of the Philippines with some Filipinos aboard that were out of the Philippine Army, and they had been discharged, and it was being brought into the American Navy. They had no shoes, and some of them had no shirts, and a few of them were just dressed in a pair of trousers and shorts. Got underway, and I got to thinking about these poor guys, and I wasn't much better off. I had a pair of Seabee greens and 1 hat, a Seabee hat. I had 2 pair of greens, and this ship had been damaged along one side of it, right where the urinals were in the troop compartments, and every time you had to go take a leak, you better watch out for the wave coming, because it's going to soak you and everything else in that compartment. We had quite amazing in this military that I was in World War II, that we had nothing to read, absolutely nothing to read, except maybe the unit paper or something like this they put out once a month. I mean, whatever. Stars and Stripes toward the end showed up, but no books, no pocket books. And lo and behold, on this ship we had one sailor with a pocketbook, a Western. And since I had been a very, well, to put it this way, I read every Western book in the library in Casper, Wyoming. And he come up with the idea that, all right, I'll read a page and pass this page on, and which he did. And we got somewhere up around Lucian's, probably off Adak somewhere. We run into a mine and banged down the side of the ship. That was exciting, because I happened to look over, just wondering what crunching was going on. I looked over the side and I saw this big mine banging. I wondering why it didn't explode. Anyway, I got the Marine Corps up with the rifles, and I think one of them was my sniper rifle, and they burned up 1 million pounds of ammunition shooting at this mine to get it to sink or blow up. And some Marine sergeant hit one of the horns, and yeah, it was a great explosion. Unfortunately, I had a pair of my spare set of greens was being washed. We threw it over the fantail, tied to a rope, and this is how we washed, was because the ship had no facilities for washing clothes, and so I withdrew my clean uniform out of the deep blue sea on this rope, and found out the shrapnel had perforated it in a million points. Still wearable, it covered most of the essential skin, but yes, it ruined a good set of greens. The reason I was wearing greens, we had lost my sea bag in a terrific typhoon on Okinawa that come across and then turned around and come back across. It took just about everything, all of our tents and ruined all of our clothes and slides and so on and so forth. And my uniforms were all ruined, so, and the battalion would not replace them, so I scrounged up some leftover green uniforms from an outfit that was going back to Australia. Some Australians who stopped by to fight a little bit when they come out of Italy or someplace. Great bunch. They had great green uniforms, and I liked their style, except the ones I picked up are full of lice, and I ended up with lice, which eventually was controlled by diesel fuel, but anyway, I made it to San Diego on the 4th of July, 1946.
So how long did it take to cross?
How long did it take? It must have took, I don't know, 2 weeks, I guess, probably. But the story on the book now is this young sailor was very sure that he tore out the pages of this Western book. Everybody read it, and after about 500 troops got through reading it, it got back to me. It was, I read it and passed it on. I hung that on the fantail. And somewhere off of probably Canada, someplace, we'd already passed the Aleutians. The bunch up front got to harassing him to hurry up and read his book. So he read it and threw it over the side. Never did find out what happened. He was on the last chapter, and he just tore the last chapter out and threw it over the side. So, yeah, we had another few days without anything to read. 4th of July, 1946, we offloaded. The Marines had to go march in a parade. That tickled the hell out of me because they were an aviation bunch. One of the Marines was I must add this as an anecdote. One of the Marines was a photographer, and he was a tech sergeant, and he used to develop on my film while I was at Naval Operation Base. They were stationed up on the hill above us someplace. I'd take all my film up and he'd develop them and print it on government paper. And because all he had to do was take the newspaper out of these planes and took photographs and he'd chop it up and made some nice pictures out of it. So we got acquainted, and he used to charge me $5 for a roll of film to get it developed. So anyway, I said sayonara to all the Marines at that point. When it went into the mess hall, and God, I never saw nothing like it. It's the first time in a year and a half I saw green vegetables, lettuce, and radishes, and milk. We had milk, and I gorged myself till we got to watermelon, and then I just really finished it off. And I went to barracks and threw everything up. Food didn't agree with me. The Navy had a spare uniform that some sailor threw away, and I went to got my third-class crow from a ship store and had it sewn on the day after, about the 5th of July. And so I was back in uniform again with a white hat and a Navy uniform and a pair of black shoes. And I got the orders to go to Bremerton, Washington. So went over, and a whole bunch of us, I say a whole bunch, it was a train car, or passenger car loaded. Got hooked onto a passenger train, the very end of it, and we went along the coast up toward Washington. I remember we stopped at Grants Pass. The good ladies of Grants Pass were out handing out strawberries in little baskets to the troops, hanging out the window. And it was just a great feast for us. And we had people who had been to China and Philippines, and of course Okinawa and Japan, and all mixed up in this train car, and all kinds of people and rates. So off we went, and we got into Seattle, and they gave me a pass to get on a ferry, and I got on a ferry, and we ended up in Bremerton. I looked at all the islands we passed, and I thought, what a wonderful place to live. I'll come back someday. Reported into the receiving station, and first thing they did was put me to work on the waterfront, tying up oil barges and stuff. And they made me get a pair of whites to do this in. I thought it was the stupidest thing. I eventually got paid, so I had enough money to buy a set of whites, and so I go tie up barges with another crew with whites on. And to this day, I think that's what really pushed me out of the Navy right then. That was my dress whites and tying up oil barges. Did that for 3 or 4 days. My whites got to the point I couldn't stand them anymore, and they couldn't stand me. And they wanted to work on my teeth, and said, we'll keep you here a couple of more weeks and give you a couple of fillings on your teeth you need to be done. I said, no way, I'll pay for it. Just give me a discharge, get me off the station. So, yes, I got off the station, got a pass, get on the ferry again. I went back over to Seattle and walked into the Union Hall, and I said, I just got discharged from the Navy, and this is where I've been, and this is what I've done, and I'd like to catch a tanker to Australia. I've never been to Australia. He says, well, this is the way it is. If you jump ship in Australia, they keep all your belongings and all your pay. So you'll be broke, nothing to wear. And Australians will deport you because you are destitute. So I said, well, that doesn't sound like a very good deal. He says, well, we can stretch the limits, and you can sign up as a able-bodied seaman. But he said, look out this window and see that lineup of men go around the block and you can't see the end of it? And I said, yes, that's people signing up for Merchant Marine. I said, well, let's just forget it. I'll just go home and see my folks. So I got on a trailway bus and we headed toward Wyoming via Idaho and Montana. After a couple of flat tires on the bus, which I helped the bus driver change, and keep in mind this is the time where there was great lack of rubber tires. Everything was worn down to the tread and Band-Aids put on that. It was the best tires they could find was put on the front, but it was always the inside rear that blew. Anyway, 2 tries of changing tires out in the hot sun in July in a wool uniform got me down to the point I could care less, but reached Billings, and of course the delay of the buses and flat tires, the bus going down to Wyoming had already departed. So the Trailway bus company was kind enough to allow me to have a bench to sleep on, and they gave me a free pass to Casper for helping to change tires. And the next morning I got on a bus and went down to Casper. I got off the bus and I had my little suitcase in my hand, and I walking up the street and I passed this construction firm that was working on a bank building, and the old foreman, Ole Olson, says, "Hey, Chris," I said, "welcome home." He says, "You want a job?" He was a Norwegian, and I said, "Sure, I'll have a job. What do you got?" He says, "I got a front-end loader I need you to operate." I said, "Fine. When you want me to start?" He says, "Tomorrow." He says, "You go home, change clothes, and go down to Union Hall and sign up." I said, "Ole, I'll do that." So I went down to Union Hall after I got home, and I said hello to my mother, and I said, she lent me her car to drive down to Union Hall with, and walked in Union Hall and said, I'm going to work for Armstead and Olson. And they said, well, what's your credentials? And I reached in my pocket and I pulled out this Navy logbook that I had of all the equipment that had been checked out on or operated. And I give them the list of the companies I'd worked for, like White Ditch Machine Company and so on and so forth. And they said, well, you qualified. We'll take $50 for the union, $3 more for your first month's dues, and you can go to work. So they give me a blue card as a full-time operating card. I worked for Armstead and Olson for the rest of that year, and up until winter time, which all construction closes in Wyoming, and or at least they should, because of the weather. Everything freezes up. And I run across a gentleman who was digging basements for a housing unit. And he said, can you run a front end loader? And I said, yes, I can. And he says, well, help me dig basements. And he says, I got an old tractor here, and I just got a new one. He said, the first hydraulic tractor front end loader west of the Mississippi. And he says, that's mine, you stay away from it. And
The old one.
so we went into digging basements in Casper, Wyoming, and moving dirt and whatever. With the end results was that you give me a dump truck, and then the tractor, and I had enough money coming in to buy a Ford convertible, which was built out of a junkyard in Denver during the war. Registered in 1933 Ford with a rumble seat, and I was able to get a Studebaker pickup. It was a 1941 Studebaker, and go about anywhere where the front end would clear. So I was in the construction business. My problem was I did a variety of different jobs, and then 6 days a week, and then run around trying to collect from dudes on Sunday. And that got awful tiresome. I decided to go to work for the large company that was rebuilding the Tesco plant, put up a catalytic converter Tesco plant, a refinery, and so went out and got a job with them, and they said, what can you do? And I said, well, I operate equipment. So they said, well, we'll do two things for you. Excuse me. He says, we can put you on as a hoisting engineer and hoist steel up the towers and so on and so forth. And says, but that's not going to last too long. And I said, well, that's all right. I know a lot about everything. And I said, I used to be a pipeliner. He said, oh, you know pipe? And I said, yes. He said, well, we've got a lot of pipe to lay here. And he says, when we get through hoisting for the operating engineers. He says, come over and hoist pipes. So I went and joined the laborers, which is against the rules and regulations of all unions. I belong to 2 unions. And yeah, I did get laid off from hoisting steel up the tower, and went to work as a tar pot operator and a pipe wrapper and a few other things that, and I was making pretty good money for the time. Since I was used to, started out in the Navy as $50 a month, I think it was, and they took $3 of it for something, I remember. I don't know what. 50 cents went to the old sailors union, old military, take care of old military, which someday when I get old, I will probably join them. But it was a good job, but it was cold. We saw temperatures at 33 below zero that winter. And I said, hey, I'm not going to put in another winter of this. This is too much. So I'm going to find me a job out on the West Coast someplace. But during the summer, I went with my original boss with digging basements. He was digging basements, and he assigned me to mine bentonite. And so I was mining bentonite in an open pit mine, and loading trucks, and they would haul it into this processing factory, and so I was doing pretty good wage-wise, and or I thought it was anyway. And thing going along fine, and I got a call from, or my mother got a call from Jack Kane. And the Kane family used to be our neighbors when we lived in Evansville, outside of Casper. I went to school with Pat Kane, and I thought a lot of him and his brothers. He had 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. Mary had a family when I first met up with her, and her sister was.
So if you can start from there.
Yes, I fell in love with a beautiful old lady sitting on a stool in Jack Kane's kitchen. We visited a while, and I remember this was on a Sunday, and I had to go attempt to collect some bills from the local alcoholics that owed me money for jobs. And I had to leave. Then it was starting to get chilly in the mornings, and I thought, well, now they ought to be a place in California for me. It wasn't about a week later that a chief gunner's mate from the recruiting office come by the project where I was, and I don't know how he found me, but I was digging bentonite way out in the Badlands and loading trucks, and he says, Chris, he says, how would you like to go back to the Seabees? I said, well, there is no more, so I've been informed. He said, but they have been reestablished. It would be 5,000 troops will be in the Seabees to start with, and they're looking for young petty officers to go back into service. So I says, I'll do it if I get to go to California this winter. He says, I'll guarantee it. First of all, I shouldn't have believed him, but
It was a recruiter.
that was a recruiter. I parked my pickup and my convertible in the back of the house, give the keys to the convertible to my sister, and the keys to Studebaker to my brother, and I went to California via Colorado. Went over to Denver, where's the main recruiting office, and to get sworn in. We all lined up, get sworn into the service, and our commander come in and says, "Now this is the way it is. I'm going to swear you in." I says, "Well, I don't want to be sworn in as a metalsmith. I want to be sworn in as a fireman, and so I can go for the rate that I'm supposed to go to, which has been established as construction driver." He says, "Don't ever give up anything you've got. You earned it, and don't give it up." He says, "You get out to California," and he says, "you will be cross-rated." And so we all swore our allegiance to the United States government once again, and then he handed me a set of orders with my name on it. I took the draft to San Francisco. Train tickets, food tickets, and so on and so forth. I had 15 people, if I recollect correctly, in my draft, and they were all, I won't say all, 75% of them are ex-prisoners out of the federal building. We had to go to the federal jail and get their belongings. There were people who had stolen mail. They had stole vehicles or trucks. One guy had been driving a truck since he got out in 1945, and they picked him up for a stolen truck. He didn't know it was stolen. He was working for a guy, but he had driven between Chicago and Denver. Even had a guy charged with arson. And in those days, some of them were not charged with anything. They were invited by the judge to join the service or go to jail or prison. And this was common in those days. You either do a prison term or do a military term. So I had a mixed match of personnel. I kept track of 2 or 3 of these people over the years, and some of them made chief petty officer. They were great people. Some of them made first class. Most of them stayed in and retired, and they turned out all right. But I went to California. I went to Yerba Buena Island, which was a receiving station under the bridge that hooks Oakland and San Francisco together. And my duties while I was there was varied. I went up and became a shore patrolman on the bridge, where people had to have someone stick their head out, make sure traffic wasn't coming to get it off the island, and wave the traffic through. Also pulled duty shore patrolman in San Francisco, and got all my shots that I hadn't got the year before, and the year before that, and the year before that. Looked like a pincushion, but Oh, I was guarding a wash machine in one of the barracks, and I happened to glance at the reason I guarded a wash machine is to keep somebody from stealing the quarters. And that was how people went on liberty. They'd break into the wash machines and dryers. They had orders, a list of orders set on the bulletin board. I looked up, and it says to APA so-and-so. It was a ship that floated up and down the west coast. And as soon as I got off duty, I run down to see the duty yeoman at the personnel office, who happened to be a first-class WWII, and storekeeper, no less, that was on duty. And I explained, here I'm a Seabee. Got a metalsmith's rate, and I was supposed to cross-rate to a construction driver, but I got orders to become a metalsmith on this APA, and I haven't been a piece of metal in my life. So she says, well, I'll call my girlfriend over the district. And she called her girlfriend over in the 13th Naval District. And the next morning I had a change of orders to go down to Port Hueneme to go to construction driver school. And I packed my new seat bag and got a train and went down to Port Hueneme and reported in. And I had been assigned to Class B school. And I went out and fell in with the Class B school personnel, and it was 99% chief petty officers, one white hat, and me. The white hat was first class, so here I am, a third class petty officer, and all these chiefs, and I could not see going to school with them because I would be nothing but a coffee boy. And I went to the CEO of the officer in charge of the construction driver school, and I explained what was happening, and he said, well, yeah, I see your point. He said, so you go through Class A school. So then he says that doesn't start for 3 more months. So I got assigned to Regimental Guard on a Seabee base of Port Hueneme, and I was mostly on a gate guard, the main gate. At that time, the base was sitting out in soybean patches or some kind of bean patches, and it was a long ways to town. It was kind of isolated. We had a ensign who was in charge of security, and he believed in true military performance by his troops. Since it was, we had to go up and stand before him in inspection before we went out on liberty, draw our liberty card. And but everything was in uniform because we're not allowed to have civilian clothes on the base. And we'd walk down the main gate, which is about a mile, and he'd ride his little bicycle down the main gate and make sure that inspected us again when we walked out, that we didn't change our uniform or neckerchief or something on the way. So a very persistent little guy. I remember this very gratefully because the shore patrol come in one night and says, I see your ensign down in a so-and-so restaurant with his wife, and his wife was a nurse. She was about 22, 3 years old, and he was not 21, so he wasn't allowed to drink, but he had a wine bottle in front of him. I says, well, bring him in, and he's not allowed to drink. He's a minor. So he was brought in. I don't know what happened to him. He never heard no more of it because I got transferred back into A school. In later years, I run into the gentleman. He was a public works officer over in Hawaii at one of the bases, and I was just coming in from Vietnam. And I got introduced to him, and he says, don't I remember you? And I said, no, sir, I don't think so, but I've got a debriefing to go to. Excuse me, please. And I disappeared from his sight. And I hope his memory. But yes, I went over to A school, and there was a hobnotch of people that was striving to be construction drivers. There was fleet machinists, fleet electricians, gunner's mates, maybe 5% of everybody in that class are ex-Seabees, and the rest of them all come off the fleet. All good people, but and we started with the basic schooling and construction driving. The things they taught was what I already knew, and I actually helped the instructors at times because I did carry a card to the Society of Engineers, construction engineers. And they were grateful, and they said, hey, no problem. And what the deal was, if you made a 3.4 score or above, you automatically cross-rated. So I completed the school in Grand Point, and all this time I was visiting with my to-be wife. Lived in Long Beach. Every weekend I had off. I was down with the Kane residents. We did a lot of talking about the future, and what was going to happen to us, and so on and so forth. And she was still in high school. Really didn't press the issue, but I finished school and got orders to Midway Island Construction Battalion Detachment 1505, and they were basically the public works of the island. So I reported in to receiving station. They put me on a train, and now they put me on a bus and sent me down to an airfield out of Los Angeles where the Navy still had aircraft in operation, and I got on my first plane ride. And there was several people on there who had never been on a plane, including me, but they were definitely frightened. We had to control them, basically. They didn't want to fly. Most of them was from the South. They'd never seen planes before, but we made Moffett Field, which is a large base out of San Jose. Anyway, at Moffett Field, I was reported into the receiving, and they said, well, it'll be a while since well, you have to go via Hawaii before you can get out to Midway. And we're loaded. Every plane we've got for the next 3-4 weeks is loaded. So I said, okay. But they assigned me the job of splicing rope and stuff to tie down the cargo with. And they found out I could splice, and that was my job. I didn't have to sweep any floors and take care of garbage and so on and so forth. So I just sat there and cut up 18-foot of rope every 10 minutes or so and put a knot in the end of it, or a splice. Anyway, I was there nearly a month before they got me on a cargo plane going out to Hawaii, and it was full of cargo that was express needed. It was full of toilet paper, Kotexes, and I don't know what else. The females run. It's a female run, and I had no seat for me, and I laid on top of the Kleenex boxes and snoozed all the way to Hawaii. In Hawaii, went to receiving station, and they said, well, it'll be a while before our station plane goes out to Midway. And I went over to the hobby shop and peeked in. I thought maybe I might find something to do. And a boatswain looked at me and he says, oh, see a Seabee patch on you. Yeah, I said, yeah. And he says, well, one of your buddies is in here and he's going out to Johnson Island. And he said he must have packed up every bit of tools I've had and sent out there to him. He said, I got nothing here left. By the way, I was still metalsmith, third class, when I didn't look at my orders when I picked them up personnel, and I didn't look at them until I was on that plane going up to Moffett Field. And I had been cross-rated from metalsmith third class to fitter pipe third class. And I don't know why. They didn't cross it. Somebody says, well, you went to school, we're cross-rated. That crossed me as pipe fitter. I went out and basically got another plane and went out to Midway, and I got off, and everybody on the island was there, and at that time they couldn't leave the island until their replacement got out. And they happened to be two pipe fitters standing there, and they got in a fight over who was getting relieved. I was supposed to relieve one of them, and I said, whoa, I said, I'm a Seabee, I'm going to Seabees. And they said, it don't make any difference, you can't go to Seabees. We'll wait and see. So I did, reported into the Seabee unit, and can you operate equipment? I said, yes, I operate equipment. I'm operating engineer, civilian life. And they said, well, we'll keep you here and operate equipment, but they need people to stand water watch. And your duty is to operate the equipment that we have here, and you stand your watches with the water department. I says, why? Because you're a pipe fitter. That turned into interesting, because Midway at that time, and I assume still does, had 3 water systems: salt water, brackish water, and fresh water that was manufactured in a boiler plant. And My job at night, when I stood my watches, was to make sure that the fresh water didn't overflow and into putting them into the tanks. And so I had a Jeep. I toured around the island off to watch and control the water that went into the water tanks. Eventually was able to cross rate to construction driver's third after many pieces of correspondence back and forth to Washington, D.C., the Navy Department, and a district, and we are going to have to stop this. We're getting rained on.
20 minutes or so. I think it's going to quit. So what year was this? 47 still, or 48?
47, 48 is over on to 48 at that time.
How long did you spend on Midway?
Year and a half.
Wow.
Yeah.
Without going back, did you get leave?
Right. Yeah, I operated cranes. I operated a crash crane on the runway, and worked as a mechanic on forklifts in between times, and stood watches at the water department.
So Midway. What battalion were you? What?
Seabee detachment,
And you were what rank at that time?
third class. But I made second there. I'm ED5 there.
So third class is E4.
E4, yeah.
So when you finally got out of there, you went back to California. Is that where we were?
Well, I corresponded heavily with Betty, and yeah, I saved up all my leave time, and when I hit San Francisco, I landed at Treasure Island, which took over receiving of all the military personnel. And I was riding a bus into the station there, and I noticed, oh my gosh, at the nursery, I had a huge nursery to maintain the island, and
Nursery?
a nursery on the Treasure Island, and they saw chief petty officers and first class petty officers using wheelbarrows hauling cow manure to put around trees and plants and stuff, and I thought, what have I run into? They must be real bad people. Anyway, I had a month and a half of leave coming to me. So I did a quick visit out at Wyoming and said hello to my parents, and found out my sister had been married and had a baby, and really we didn't correspond back and forth with my mother very often. And she is the one that kept me posted, except my father. If I'll have to step back to Okinawa time. I received a postcard from a sheriff that had been 3 months under transit. My father had forwarded it because sheriff says, you have been served a warrant for failure report to the draft board. And I wrote him back and I says, you can come and get me. I'm knee deep in mud. The maggots are crawling up over my kneecaps, and I'd be glad to get the hell out of here. But he never answered me. I was not arrested when I got back to Casper, so, and my name was up on the front of the courthouse as being serving in World War II. But I charged on down to Cheyenne, Wyoming, where my sister lived. She had married a sergeant, an ex-Navy type from Okinawa campaign, and he re-enlisted in the Navy because the Army went to lunch, and the Navy called him into. The Navy went to lunch, and the Army conned him into going back in the Army. But anyway, they were happy, and he was with the engineer outfit working on the runway in Cheyenne. They caught a bus on back out to Long Beach and got a hotel room down below, and between my hotel room and my future mother-in-law, great wishes. I had the couch, and I enjoyed 30 days of leave time, and went back into Treasure Island. And by the way, I got I have laid away my wedding and engagement ring at the Navy Exchange in Treasure Island. And so when I went back up to Treasure Island, I mailed both the wedding and engagement ring down mailed it down to Betty. And it says, and sat there and waited orders. And the first set of orders they wanted to give me was to go to they call it MCB 1, Mobile Construction Battalion 1, was being activated in Virginia, and they was looking for people to fill the ranks, and they were going to where were they going to? Oh, that British island off of anyway, the British own the island and do work on the runway down there. I said, fine, I'll go. Give me my meal tickets and a train pass. And he says, well, I give you the meal tickets, but this is the end of the fiscal year. And he says, I don't have train passes anymore. It'll cost you $73 to cross the United States. I said, well, if the Navy's that broke, I don't want to cross the United States. He says, okay. The next morning, I had orders to Adak, Alaska. Yes, they called it NCB 124 at Adak, Alaska. And I zipped in there and become a dispatcher and overseer at one part of the bus depot moving people around the island. And I was second class and then wore a hash mark. And so it was pretty routine, except the Korean War broke out during my stay there. That was in, I believe, June 1950. And all of a sudden we had airplanes coming through and all kinds of troops, and it become a 24-hour day of transporting troops from airport to Chow Hall, and we had no place to put them. And so my hitch was up. My enlistment was up because I was on a 3-year enlistment. And I went up to receiving station to go back to the States, and the boatsmate come along and says, Chris, go back to your unit. You have been extended a year. He says, they can't extend me a year. He said, no, the president extended you a year. So that got another year from our great president. So a year later, I finally got out, and I went back to let me see where it was. I went back to the States one time when I enlisted. I went back to the States, and we got married in Long Beach. And again, I had a whole bunch of vacation time coming. We took a world cruise through the West and had a great time visiting relatives, and back to Long Beach, and I had saved enough money to buy a 46 Chevrolet coupe. And so I reported back into Sand Point over to Seattle to go back to ADAC, and there were hundreds of Seabees sitting there waiting for transportation. So they all pounced on me and asked me how the island was, and I gave them a good dirty look at it. It was cold, misty, rainy, and snowy all year long, and I slept through summer one July day. Sun was out for 3 hours, and well, that helped the morale. But they took me, and all of a sudden they shipped me over to the Pier 91, as they called it. Is the receiving station for the Navy, and all the ships tied up there. And I checked in there, and the next day the executive officer called me up and he says, "Oh, you're a second-class construction driver, and I'm looking for a garbage king on the pier. All you have to do is make sure the damn garbage is picked up and taken to a dump, and make sure it's cleaned around the trash cans and all this." And I said, "You got your fella, Captain." And next day he called me up and he says, "Sorry." He says, "I can't do that. I have to hire a civilian or something, some gobbledygook." But anyway, I told Betty she couldn't come up to Seattle. And I was already looking for an apartment. So they sent me down to the Air Force and McCord, and put me on a plane that was, I don't know what it was. It was one of these ones with a glass front. It had no heat in it in the rear, but they did give me a set of orders along with everybody else that was on the plane, probably about 20 of us. Had jump seats along the side. And I'll tell you, the time we got over Canada, we was freezing. They did give us foul weather gear and boots to wear. My foul weather gear hit me just above the knee. I couldn't wear it, but I did cover my body up with it. But the plane, I don't know, it took a long time to get up there, about 10 hours, I guess. It's a 4-engine cargo plane. and all the air from the hydraulic in the belly of it lowered the elevator, and this elevator leaked like a sieve. And oh my God, it was frost all over the interior of the plane. I don't know what kept it up, but we got to Elmendorf, and Elmendorf said, "Well, what do I do with all you people?" And somebody says the army, so they sent us all to the army. And they put us in a barracks that had been swept out by a year and a half. All the trash was clear up above the windows in one end of it. It took us 2 weeks to get out of there. The group of chief petty officers were great about going up and complaining to the Army and the Air Force and anybody else they could find. Sending messages to Kodiak. We had a lot of Kodiak people there, and the station, and finally the station at ADAC got a hold of command the 13 Naval District, and said, "We got to get those people out of there," and they started throwing us over to Kodiak, and then finally we made it up to ADAC. At that time, I had to start all over again in the Seabee unit, so I would become an operator of a grader and mobile cranes, and I was their chief operator. And all of a sudden, the 1,300 Seabees we had that piled up in Seattle, they arrived. We had no foul weather gear to give them. We had no hammers, no nails, nothing to work with. We finally got some material flown in, and they rehabbed their old Quonset huts from World War II. It has stood vacant for 5 years, and they're good for the Quonset hut the last 5 years in the willow walls up there. But anyway, they all survived. And I stayed with my grader, and we had a lot of supervisor people, and so I didn't have to chase anybody around. I'd go out in the morning and get my grader and to go to work. My first job in the morning was go up and plow the road on Mount Moffat, the mountain that overlooks the base, and plow it so the personnel could go up and relieve the night crew. They were an ornery bunch up there. They wouldn't feed me. They wouldn't get me get too close to the base, for fear I might learn something, you know. And one day I got tired of their crap, and I said they went to mess hall for early chow, and the cook, duty cook, gave me a spoonful of beans, which and one piece of cold toast. I said, "Give me some more beans," and he said, "No, that's the ration." One spoonful of beans. I counted the beans, and they had 51 Navy beans. And I said, "I can't work on 51 Navy beans." So he called his chief, and that chief called my battalion chief, and battalion chief called the storekeeper, and the storekeeper called our storekeeper, and finally my commanding officer showed up, and he says, "How come you need more than 51 beans?" I said, "Because nobody feeds me. Nobody will give me a box lunch at this end, and nobody will feed me at the communication station because I don't have a clearance to get in." "Well, why not?" because someone in the organization is screwed up. Besides, Seabees get extra rations. And I haven't seen any extra rations since I've been here. He said, what do you mean extra rations? Seabees get hard labor rations. He says, I never heard of it. He turns to his flight officer and he says, have you heard of it? He says, yes. He says, the station flight officer says, I get extra money for the Seabees, but I just throw it in the general pot so everybody eats better. So they quickly fixed me a meal of ham and eggs, and I went to work plowing a road out to communication station, and chow improved. They eventually come along and converted stuff to send out to the job sites, the different job sites, to carry sandwiches, coffee, and so on and so forth to the Seabees that I was out working. I was, I say, second class, and I studied real hard on nothing. I sent off for correspondence from all the hardware people, the rope makers, the cable makers, the equipment up makers, and I got manuals and magazines and newspapers and stuff what went in the construction industry, because the Navy did not have a study program for going up for construction rates. They had created the Seabees, but they hadn't created anything for guidance. They had a crew of people back on the East Coast or in the Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, making what is called blue books for the construction drivers, the mechanics, the utility people, the builders, and surveyors of basic work, and then went on up to chief petty officers. Anyway, these blue books were ready and published, but nobody sent any overseas. They sent them out to command for, and they said, well, this is what the tests are going to be based on. But overseas, nobody had got these blue books, unless they stole one when they left the station. But I studied real hard, correspondence courses, every one I could get a hold of, and I went to my division officer, and I says, I'd like to take some officer correspondence courses. So he conferred with my chief, and he came back. He said, yeah. He says, I'll authorize that. I said, and he said, what do you want to start with? So I said, cold weather engineering. And the first one was on how to build runways on the ice. And it was amazing, man. I went through that like something else. But anyway, time for the rating test come up, and I was pretty well, on the military side of it, and I knew what I was doing. On a professional side, I knew what I was doing, and I come out as the only first class at ADAC that made rate. My buddy, who was out on Midway with me, was at Point Barrow, and he made first class. We only.
Buddy's name?
Yeah, I was with him in the school, and also Port Hueneme when he went on to make Master Chief. And but at any rate, so I become a first class, and the first thing that happened, they says, we're sending you down to Dutch Harbor. We got to take the equipment off of Dutch Harbor and bring it up here. There'll be a ship pulling in 7 days. We're flying you down. and this is what we want, the crash crane and the mobile crane and so on and so forth. So I got on this amphibious airplane and flew down to Dutch Harbor via Aleutian Island volcanoes because nobody could see. It was fog. Radar did not work on the plane. And the pilot, which happened to be the executive officer of the base, says, everybody look out your windows when you can, and if you see a bank along under the wing, let me know what side and tell me which way to go. And this is the way we went down. And we got down over Dutch Harbor and hit a downdraft, and we dropped to about 6,000 feet. You went down to just, I could count the fish in the water off the pier at Dutch Harbor before it stopped. And he got it under control. He says, we're going home. He said, I'm not doing this. And we went home doing the same thing, looking out the windows. And, well, I should call them portholes, I guess, and these amphibs. But anyway, we made it back. And the next morning, they cranked up the seagoing tug, and I put all my tools and cables and stuff on that, and got a helper who was a striker for a steel worker, and we went down to Dutch Harbor on this tugboat, and halfway down Aleutian Sea, we had all out with our wrenches and baseball bats and anything, batting ice off of the tug. We had a close shave, just nearly capsized, but I could see it all there. It was cold. I thought, well, I hope our next cruise is get out of this weather. But we made it down. Everybody was seasick, including me, except for one boatswain mate who was on the helm, and he was sick part of the time going down. He made her down into the bay, and everybody sighed a breath of relief and started cleaning up after. But we, me and my helper, we got a little boat, and they took me over to the Naval Operation Base that was across the bay, and that was a local taxi. You waved a flag if you wanted to go one way or the other, a red flag. And some drunken Aleut wanted a buck crank up his 80 horsepower Johnson and zip across. But there was a civilian over there who he says, I am the caretaker of this base, he says, and I'm the only person civil service here. He says, I own the only legal bar in town. I am the water commissioner, and I am the mayor. He said, nobody else wants the job. So I was all glad to meet him, you know, and he said, well, here comes the Marines. And lo and behold, the first Marine down on the pier was the sergeant that did my film over in Okinawa. And he had re-enlisted. He was from back east somewhere in the mines. They wanted him to go down the mine, and he had been re-enlisted in Marines, dropped their rate, and become a sergeant instead of tech sergeant. And he was infantry type at that time. And he welcomed me with arms and sent me with me and my partner up with a bunk in the Marine barracks. And we had a Navy cook and a Navy machinist mate who operated the generator for the Marines, and they had their own self-enclosed building they stayed in. The Marines were there to guard the base, because when they evacuated the base, everything was left as right there. I had batteries, huge batteries brought down for the turntable and the crane, and borrowed a Jeep from the Marines, and we towed them back up in the hills, and we got the crash crane. It was a turntable with a huge crane on it, and got it down to the pier and dismantled and separated and put up on barrels and pallets. And hey, we did that the first day. The second day we got the crane down and a bulldozer and some other piece of equipment I remember. But so